Look, so welcome, in fact, to this Fireside Chat. It's rather a special one, yeah? Because it's the 21st. So, yeah, not bad. How did we survive so long? I'm not quite sure, yeah? It's a real great pleasure, in fact, to have, Will with me, Will Morris. It's fair to say you have had many careers, yes? A very distinguished career in GE, yeah? Very distinguished. For almost a decade now, you've led the BEAC, yeah? Just under a decade?
Actually, a little less than that.
A little less, I always exaggerate a little bit, yeah? Half a decade, let's compromise this. So half a decade leading BEAC. And maybe you want to say a few words about the BEAC Tax Committee, yeah? And what has that meant in practice is that you've really been the main interlocutor between the OECD and the business community, yeah? And I didn't have the pleasure of working, well, not as chair, working with you when I was at the OECD, but I know from my colleagues that they very much appreciate you because, one, you're a man of much patience, yes? Very, very important, yeah? Much patience. Two, you're a consensus builder, yeah? And that clearly has been extremely important in the current BEPS environment, yeah? And then three, you're a bridge builder. You recognize the importance of having a good relationship between government, business, the advisories, the academics, yeah? And I think those qualities have really been a key, in a sense, to the way that the OECD has been able to take forward the work on BEPS over the last 5 years, yeah? So the topic for today then is, can multilateralism survive? It's a sort of a funny title, isn't it, yeah? Survive what? That's the first question. Survive BEPS? That's quite a challenge, yeah? Survive the emergence of the BRICS, yeah? Because, people have forgotten. I mean, I can remember a time, where China would come to OECD meetings and just sit there and say nothing at all. Nothing. Huh? So those days have gone. So in a sense, you've got a much more confident group of countries, non-OECD countries, that not just have things to say, but actually expect to be heard as well, yeah? And from that perspective, I think things have changed. And then, in a sense, when you talk about multilateralism, of course, you have to mention President Trump, yeah? Although, well, yes, we do, I'm afraid, yeah? So, in a sense, multilateralism, there are challenges around, but we'll try to use part of this fireside chat to actually see a little bit in terms of how those challenges are being addressed, yeah? The format, it's the usual format that we'll have. We'll have 4 rounds of debate. We have this physical audience here. There's about 80 of you here. We have a virtual audience of another 45, 50. It's the largest audience we've had since Pascal.
I'm honoured.
Take that back as a compliment, yes?
I will do.
Jonathan, stop laughing, yeah? So, virtual, physical audience, yes? We're going to try to make it an interactive. I'm actually going to try to have more discipline on myself and talk less. I know. Well, you stand a good chance because I got a cold, yes, so let me then. Very informal. I'll try to bring everybody in. We are going to try to finish at 6:15 because we have drinks. 6:15 is fine, yeah? Okay, so, well, maybe just a quick word on BEACS because and the Fiscal Committee just before we get started, yeah?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank all of you for showing up on a snowy day. I know some of you had no choice, but to those of you who did have a choice, thank you very much for coming. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I only actually came to WU for the first time last December, but this appears to be part of an accelerating schedule. So about BEAC, I've been chair of the BEAC Tax Committee for just over 5 years. BEPS and I grew up together, as I like to say, and the month that I became chair of the committee, the finance ministers of France, Germany, and the UK wrote to the G20 asking them to ask the OECD to start to look into all this troublesome stuff that was going on. And while we may have had hints of what was going to happen, I don't think anybody in their wildest imagination would have dreamt that 5 years later we'd find ourselves with 15 action items, with, using this in the nicer sense of the word, derivative, ATAD work, and lots of other things which have grown out of that, and now a digital project which seems very much to be be a follow-on from that. So, you know, a real sea change in the way that things have been done, and BEAC has been part of that. As Jeffrey would tell you, and probably may tell you over drinks, the relationship between BEAC and the OECD has had its ups and downs. And there have been times when it's been more cooperative, and there have been times when it's been slightly more contentious. And obviously, one of the decisions we had to make right at the beginning of the BEPS process was, well, which of these is it going to be? And there were clearly some who wanted to push back on some elements of BEPS. And you know, to be clear, during the BEPS process, as the papers came out, and as there were numerous public consultations, there were points that we pressed back on. But the point that I made into it was threefold. And it goes partly to what Jeffrey was saying about, you know, the nice things about bridge building and consensus seeking. I mean, there are people who regard that as not necessarily always being a good thing. And you can find those people on the internet if you want to. But, you know, sometimes that's viewed as not leaning in enough, not having a differentiated enough position. But the point of view that I took was partly practical and was partly policy-based. And as Jeffrey didn't say a long time ago, I worked for the US government, and I still think to this day that having sat on that side of the table, as well as on the business side of the table, at least if you have some element of empathy inside of you, allows you to understand where people are coming from, and therefore hopefully to come towards the middle, rather than to sort of shout at each other across you know, a void. And you know, in BEPS there were a couple of things which were going on. Firstly, that the political pressure was crystal clear. It was not necessarily that widespread, but in a number of key OECD countries, particularly in Western Europe, even in Northwestern Europe, that pressure was very, very strong. And that was going to produce something, had begun to produce things. I mean, we'd already seen, in terms of protest movements, we'd seen Uncut, we'd seen Occupy Wall Street. Politicians had begun to respond to that. There were these, you know, increasing budget deficits. There was talk of austerity, and to a certain extent, there was a certain amount of transference going on between the political community and the business community, because you know what had been seen as a very good relationship prior to the financial crisis, you know, lightening the burden of regulation, abolishing boom and bust, all of that type of stuff. After the financial crisis, which definitively proved that that had not happened, you know, somebody needed to take the blame, and politicians don't always find themselves, you know, totally prepared to do that. So there had to be some bad guys, and business fitted the bill. At the same time, so there's that political pressure. It clearly caught light, and you know, not just in the NGO community, which is one of the business narratives sometimes, but it clearly caught popular imagination as well. And that was partly in the media, it was partly in social media in particular. So there was this pressure on business, and it wasn't just in relation to tax, it was much more broadly than that. It was trust. More generally, in the UK, it was about CEO pay, it was about 0 hours contracts. Yes, it was about tax planning as well. So there was this political pressure. There was also the fact that, you know, I think it was incumbent on the business community to face up to the fact that there was some tax planning which was sort of pretty out there. You know, it really was. I mean, I remember, you know, when I first went to GE, some folks coming in to see us, and they'd bring you these structures, and you'd look at them and you go, really? Really? I mean,
very creative, yes, very creative.
Well, beyond creative, actually. I mean, you know, these were things which plucked words at random out of the dictionary, applied them to statute, didn't apply normal statutory interpretation. And, you know, those are the arguments. So anyway, so there was tax planning, which was out there, and that's unhealthy in the end. In part because only some people can afford to do it, or perhaps because only some people have, you know, quite have the nerve to do it. So it unbalances the tax system from that point of view. There is always, and we'll talk more about this later, there's always a sort of a put and a take in the tax system. It doesn't really matter who starts it, but if one side, you know, does one thing, whether it's business or the tax authorities, then the other side will react to that. And you'll get these reactions, and the more it becomes a sort of a cat and mouse thing, the worse things will become. So that is distortive, essentially. I'm going to use an economic word for a moment. That's distortive, and that's not good. Then there was another fact, which was, again, was incontrovertible, which was that some elements of the global rules simply had not kept pace with globalization. And that's a twofold thing. The first is, in terms of the way that tax authorities interacted, but even more particularly the way that tax policy folks interacted, there was nowhere near the close contact, the global reach that many actually, multinationals have managed to achieve. So there was a need, in a sense, for the governments to catch up with that. And then there was also the fact that, one of the things that globalization had done, particularly with the growth in intellectual property, was it had outpaced where the international rules were. So those rules needed to be updated and needed to be caught up. So, the view that I advocated for and that BEAC ended up accepting was that we had to lean into this and to play a constructive role in trying to help these changes come about, partly to meet the politics, but partly also because there were real things which needed to be dealt with, whether it was super aggressive tax planning or whether it was rules that hadn't kept up. And that was a position that we took pretty much throughout the BEPS process. So it was to always engage where we could offer that practical advice to do that. We did a lot of that in country-by-country reporting, not just in terms of commenting on the papers themselves, not just in terms of what the tax folks said, but bringing in systems people, bringing in accounting people to explain to the country delegates why some things were easier to do, why some things were harder to do, why it wasn't like, sort of reshuffling a deck of cards, but it was actually more like replumbing the house sometimes. How do ERPs work? What are ERPs? What does ERP stand for? Those types of issues. So that was part of what we did. In some cases we pushed back. In other cases we actually helped to produce research when it came to interest deductibility, for example. And there was some discussion, around EBITDA, and should it be 10% of EBITDA or 30% of EBITDA? We commissioned some research, which looked at the OECD had essentially, at least in phase one, looked at a couple of hundred companies and based the range on that. We looked at 60,000 companies from larger databases, sent that evidence into the OECD, and they acted on that. That's why you had the corridor. In the end, there were other places where we were honestly less successful, and there were some places where, again, as we can discuss a little later, because of the time pressure, while there was high-level agreement on what the answer should be, there was not the detailed work below that which would allow actually for countries to really sign on to something which was truly multilateral, as opposed to just an agreement. And that's a gap which still exists in some cases, and I hope at some stage we can come back to that. But BEAC, and this was a huge surprise. It's a huge credit to BEAC. It's not much to do with me. BEAC is really an association of associations. So, whatever the major trade association is in country A, B, or C, so it's USCIB in America, it's Swedish Confederation, wherever Krista has gone, it's a CBI in the UK. It's those types of organizations, and then, some of the people who are members of that, they bring very different things to this. And yet, there was agreement, firstly, to actually devote a huge amount of time to this. And this was mostly for people who, unlike me, didn't have policy in their job title, but actually you had to, sort of run tax departments and do returns and, figure out the compliance and interact with tax authorities. They devoted a lot of time during the BEPS process to doing this. But the other was, we always managed to reach consensus. You look back through the BEAC comments which went in, there are a handful of footnotes or appendices where people disagreed. For the rest, there was almost complete agreement, and that staggered me. And that was a real tribute to the people who were involved in that process and the seriousness with which they took it. So, that's BEAC. It's been a great experience. I've got more to go, so I'm not stepping out quite yet. Nor am I, however, going to.
I hope not. No.
I'm not going to hang on forever either. I promise you that.
Don't get carried out, yeah.
No.
There have been precedents.
I've seen that happen.
Yeah.
So, to your question about multilateralism, in a sense it is an odd question, because what I've just told you is all about constructive engagement and about high-level agreement. I'll come back to that. and about what BEPS has done. And yet, at the same time, there is in the same way that there's there are pushes and pulls and other things, there are pushes and pulls in this, because one of the things that BEPS has also done is to give people permission to, in some cases, think things, in other cases, do things that previously they wouldn't have done before. In part because they didn't talk to each other, in part because things always took longer, and in part because some things were simply off the table. One of the things that BEPS did was to put a significant number of things on the table. The agreements, the action items, the reports, don't cover all of those. But at the same time, a lot more stuff was talked about, a lot more things were discussed, and a lot more things became acceptable to consider. Now, the world was heading in that direction. It wasn't that this was, absolutely something which dropped out of a clear blue sky, but it did accelerate that process. And the other thing which happened, and I think this is very important, we can come back to this, you can ask questions about it, is that what BEPS did was to very strongly encourage, and this is not entirely a good thing, and we do need to break out of it, but what it did was it built a narrative around tax policy, which basically says tax policy is largely, if not entirely, about preventing tax avoidance. And it takes tax policy out of the more general economic realm and puts it into this narrower box. And during BEPS, that was fine. That's what BEPS was around. I mean, the clue's in the name. BEPS was about preventing base erosion and profit shifting. But it has led to a narrative which has been picked up outside of the tax world by the press, that everything around tax policy is about preventing tax avoidance. There's a sort of subtext that there are good people and bad people. I won't identify them. But there is that subtext as well. And that therefore, the job of tax policy is to, by preventing tax avoidance, collect more revenue. Now, the OECD has tried to push back on that. Some of the work around inclusive growth, for example, is about broadening that perspective out. But the BEPS narrative has put down very strong roots. And you see it each time a story comes up. And I can say until I'm blue in the face. Anybody can say until they're blue in the face. The piece of tax planning we're talking about was actually entered into 10 or 15 years ago. We haven't given BEPS a chance to work on this. But you see from the reaction that it gets in the press, on social media, that this narrative is firmly established. And therefore, I think it's going to be difficult to break out of that. But we do need to do it. And that is the danger. So those two things go together, I think, to make up what are the dangers to multilateralism. The first is that a whole lot more has been discussed and essentially now become acceptable to do. And the second is that there is a narrative which either drives politicians and policymakers or again gives policymakers and politicians permission to go in a certain direction. And therefore, that's what you see in unilateral actions. There is not a single, there are very few unilateral actions which are premised on the basis of, I need to do this to help my economy grow.
But I think that's all correct, Will. One thing that has driven that debate quite a lot is the fact that because of the financial crisis, a lot of governments needed money, yeah? No?
Yes.
So, people call it about a money grab, that people, governments are looking, we need more revenue. I completely agree with you that if you approach tax policy purely from a compliance revenue-raising perspective, you lose the broader picture, yeah? And I was very pleased, in fact, when the G20 launched this work on tax and inclusive growth. Very pleased when they looked at the whole issue of tax uncertainty, yeah? Because you've got to have that broader perspective. And the thing that worries me now, and we'll come to this, is when you look at the digital economy, if you approach the digital economy purely from a BEPS perspective, you probably get the wrong answers, huh?
That's right. And, there's an old corporate saying that you can't cut your way to a profit. And, likewise, you're unlikely in the end to be able to tax your way to growth. But
well, I mean, the best way to grow your revenues is to grow your economy,
yes.
Yeah? But it's interesting when you look at multilateralism, because in one sense, looking over the last decade, it's actually surviving and prospering multilateralism, yeah? Because, you see you have the global endorsement of the exchange of information standard. I mean, just think of that change on bank secrecy, yeah? Switzerland, yeah? How many years did we spend from the mid-1990s talking, yeah? Now, nobody questions it, yeah? The Global Forum on Exchange of Information, yeah? The best peer review, the most profound peer review process anywhere in the whole of the OECD, yeah? Another example of multilateralism. When you look at the multilateral endorsement by the G20 of the 15 BEPS actions, yes? Quite an amazing achievement to get, China and the US to actually agree to something, yeah? Or you look at the multilateralization of instruments, the Multilateral Convention on Administrative Assistance, yeah? How many countries have signed up to that? Now, that's a big move forward. The emergence slowly of moving away from unilateral APAs and rulings towards bilateral and even slower towards multilateral, yeah? Or the way that tax authorities, under organizations like JITSIG, are now actually beginning to have a multilateral dialogue, yeah? So in a sense, I think, multilateralism is quite alive. And in some ways, it's the way that tax administrations are responding to the globalization of companies. You're recognizing you're never going to get a World Tax Organization. Even within the EU, it's proving quite difficult to get harmonized rules. But the one thing you can do is actually multilateralize your cooperation, multilateralizing your rule. And of course, the ultimate thing then is the MLI, yeah? No? So it's a sort of an interesting dialogue that multilateralism, it's alive, that maybe there are issues in the way that it's then, you move from endorsing the multilateralism to actually having a consistent implementation.
I think that's the issue. And I mean, multilateral, I think if you look at this from a government point of view, multilateralism looks more alive than if you look at it from a business point of view. And to be sure, there's a glass half full and a glass half empty issue here. But I mean, if you look at some of the implementation issues, so you're right. And I mean, again, BEAC was very closely involved, constructively involved, in all of Action 13, so not just on country-by-country reporting, but also on the master file and the local file. And yes, there is agreement on how that should be done. The OECD, again, has done some great work in trying to put definition, particularly around country-by-country, which obviously worries people, worries businesses a lot, has done a lot of work around that, has done work with tax authorities to help them interpret that. What businesses on the ground see is, while there is, for example, with the master file and the local file, a template for that, many countries are adding a little bit over here, or a little bit over here, or a little bit over here. And likewise, I think people are still worried about country-by-country reporting because they don't know the bunch of questions that they're going to be getting from tax authorities about that. So while there is, yes, multilateral agreement, on that, and there is a multilateral system in place, and there is a multilateral organization which is helping to provide information about that. There is still concern that at a unilateral level, there are differences. We'll work that out, I suspect, over time.
But to work it out, I think you require leadership of large countries, because the OECD traditionally, it was always the United States that actually led the tax debate, yeah? Right in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. And the way what would happen would be, the US would devise a new, like for example, the transfer pricing, and then they would use the OECD to take that out, yeah? No? That was the tradition, and frankly, nothing ever happens at the OECD unless the US either absence from the table or says yes, yeah? And they pay 23% of the budget, so it's perfectly understandable that should be the case, yeah? The interesting thing now is with a much more assertive China, yeah? And China being much more engaged in the OECD, yeah? Mm-hmm. At what point will they actually say, well, we would actually quite like to exercise this leadership role? And you can see it coming up a little bit in the One Belt, One Road, the BRI initiative, yeah? And that's perhaps not a bad thing, because at the end of the day, maybe as China becomes both a capital importer and capital exporter, yeah, its interests actually get more aligned with where the US is. Huh?
And I mean, that's a very interesting point. In fact, there are a couple of interesting points in there. Let me just see if I can go on a couple of them. I mean, one of the things that happened during the BEPS process, and again, I'm not going to point any fingers, but one of the things that happened during the BEPS process was that, again, part of the narrative which grew up around that was essentially the US doesn't matter. And, things can be done without the US being involved. And that, I think, was highly unfortunate for all sorts of reasons, and I'll leave it there. But one thing that I do think is that we're in a different place now, and I think that actually the US is poised once again to play a more important role in the OECD. And I think we'll see this in digital. I don't know, but I think we'll see it in digital. And I think that is to be encouraged, because you cannot, or should not at least, leave out the world, still arguably the world's largest economy, from a set of rules. Now, the interesting thing about China, of course, is that, as you said, there is beginning to be some convergence between some US views and some Chinese views. And that actually, that worries some of the other OECD members.
There's much more convergence between the US and China than between the US and the UK, yeah? Putting it bluntly.
Well, yeah, quite possibly. As the holder of both passports, I'm not going to comment on that. But when it comes to China and to the US, I mean, for example, and this I think is at this point relatively well-verified rumor, at the task force of the digital economy at the beginning of December, there was more convergence between the US and the Chinese point of view than anybody had ever expected, in the direction of destination-based taxes. And, who knows if that's the way forward, but what it does tell you is, firstly, the US is back, and secondly, the US has a slightly different position, which is going to, alter the kaleidoscope, I guess. And that's worth watching. But again, the good thing, the really good thing, is that both China and indeed the other BRICS, I mean, I personally think it is a remarkably good sign. Whatever you may think about certain aspects of the Brazilian tax system, I think there's a remarkably good sign that Brazil has applied to join the OECD. What a great thing.
And in a sense, I think you could make quite a coherent case for saying the US, and we'll come to this later on, but the US tax reform is an endorsement of BEPS in many ways.
We will come back to that later.
Okay, look, that's we'll move on to the second round then, which is very much on the question of oh yes, he's such a good chairman. Would anybody like to have a question? Not to me, but to him. The young lady, I keep calling her a young lady. I'll have to ask you how old you are later on, yeah? Go ahead.
It's a compliment, thank you for me, just calling me young lady. I'm turning 40 almost, so it's quite a compliment for me, thank you. Now, just a short question. Myself working for a multinational, I would be interested in knowing more about how BEAC interacts with the OECD and how they produce the action points. And, what is the difference between commenting the individual papers, because I, for instance, wrote feedback to BEPS Action Point 13 for Swiss Bankers Associations, and what BEAC exactly does. So, like the difference between writing simply a comment, like a representative of a multinational, and working for BEAC.
Well, so BEAC is, as I said, it's an association of associations. It is very thinly staffed at the top. I think there are 7 people who work for BEAC. But the most important thing about BEAC is that it, along with the Trades Unions Advisory Committee, which is now an umbrella for for the broader civil society groupings, is one of the 2 bodies mentioned in the Constitution of the OECD as being a stakeholder with ability to feed into the OECD. So, at one level, it doesn't do stuff which is much different to what other people do. It does pull together probably a broader selection of people, because it's not just the OECD, it's also the observer countries in the OECD. It pulls together those comments and it submits them to the OECD. It has a role, not that I play a huge part in this, it has a role in all of the the various other meetings that the OECD does. So meetings with the ministers, meetings with the ambassadors. Obviously, well, not obviously, this doesn't always happen. As I said, the relationship has had its ups and downs, but certainly in the past 5 years, mostly if the OECD wants to reach out to the business community, informally as well as formally, then they'll call BEAC and say, can you help us reach out to to X or Y. So the most recent example, which some of you will have seen, which just went out a couple of days ago, is that with the Brazilian accession, there's a meeting in Brasilia right at the end of this month, the end of this month, with the Brazilian tax authorities and Brazilian business, and they've asked BEAC if BEAC members can help, if we can help pull together comments and get people to go to Brasilia to talk about this. So we have a coordinating role inside the business community. Again, I'm very clear when I talk to people that, I have no desire to be a bottleneck, but if we can be a useful funnel into the OECD, then we'll do that. If people want to go and talk to the OECD directly, or indeed if the OECD directly want to reach out to other people, then that's fine. I do make the point that if they do that consistently, then we'll probably be less useful. But it's a group which comes together generally with some common interests. And the Swiss Bankers Association is part of BEAC, as you know, and corresponds. During the BEPS process, we were obviously at all of the consultations. We generally got an opening statement and a closing statement as well as some of that. But it was really just to pull the business community together and give it this entry point which the OECD constitution provides into the OECD.
I think one thing that I regret a little bit, you remember when we did the electronic commerce, we established these technical advisory groups, which was with BEAC and with government. And what was interesting about the tags was that business was not coming in to comment on drafts. Business was actually sitting down and drafting the drafts. And I thought that was, it was time-consuming, it was frustrating, but the products, I think, were very good. And I'm pretty sure that the tags are now currently only used on the VAT side. Tom, something to pick up at one point, I think, reinvent the tags, yeah? Any other questions? No? Okay, why don't we move on then to the second round, which is on tax uncertainty, yeah? I think one thing is very clear that partly, and perhaps even mainly because of BEPS, we are going to move into a period where there's going to be a lot of tax uncertainty around the We've seen that there are an ongoing debate, an unresolved debate on source versus residence. BEPS Action 1 was supposed to find a resolution to that, but it didn't really do it, yeah? It was taken off the table mainly by the US, yeah? We've seen that a lot of the rules that are coming out, particularly on the transfer pricing, they look increasingly subjective, the PPT, yeah? It's almost like saying, well, the only way we can actually keep the arm's length principle alive is by making it, more flexible. Making it more flexible makes it more subjective. Making it more subjective creates more uncertainty, yeah? And that's a debate we can have, yeah? I think there's a feeling amongst developing countries and the NGO community that tax treaties are not working for them. They're not getting their fair share tax, yeah? We have the unfortunate situation that at the same time as we see these cross-border disputes arising, the mechanisms to resolve them, the MAP process, and it's a big step forward what the FTA has done, in fact, improving MAP. But the last step of going for arbitration, you've still only got 26, 27 countries, including Fiji. Fiji signed on to arbitration. That's right, yeah? Fiji signed on to arbitration? I think they have, yeah? Anyway, they need to sign on to arbitration before the sea rises above and the island disappears. So you got all these sources of uncertainty that are there, yeah? And sort of my question, for you, Will, is how are we going to deal with that? We've had the G20 report. I presume there'll be another report to the G20 from the OECD and the IMF, in fact, on that. But what can governments do, in fact, in this type of environment you're never going to eliminate uncertainty, yeah? But at least to make it manageable from a business perspective?
I'm just going to hand those to you just for a second. We can deal with those later. But, it's a great question, and again, I want to give credit to the OECD and indeed the EU, who have also opened up a project on this, for looking at this issue, because clearly when you are making investment decisions, you need to have some certainty around what it is that you're doing. There are some people, I've heard...
So you're not going to name anybody, are you? It's really frustrating.
I'm not going to name anybody. I've been doing this for long enough not to name anybody. But you hear some people at some conferences saying, oh, business always says that. And lurking underneath that is an idea which I think we need to, just to squash immediately, which is that there is an amount of investment which will happen come what may. And it'll happen whether tax is high, it'll happen whether tax is low, it'll happen whether other conditions are good, whether other conditions are bad. That is simply not true. There are 101 things that companies can do with their money other than invest them overseas. They can invest it at home. They can return it to their shareholders. They can buy shares back. They can sit on it. There's been quite a lot of sitting on cash, in various periods over the past 10 years. They can reduce their debt. They can do all sorts of things with money. So, investment is sensitive to in-country conditions. And I'm not going to pretend that all of those are tax, but some of them can be tax. Okay? So, uncertainty is something that we do need to think about. Now, there's a question, okay, well, how do we measure what uncertainty is? And that, to be sure, is subjective. We have started to try to do that. The OECD did a survey. Admittedly, it was sort of slightly skewed to Bulgaria. But that was because Georgia, who is very charming, ran into an important Bulgarian who then went back to Bulgaria and encouraged 100 of his buddies to file a report. Nevertheless, even without that, there were still 600 widely spread answers. And before that, actually, a small group that I'm involved in called the ETPF had done a survey as well. And you can, where these surveys of uncertainty become important is not really in the first go, although that can be, because that can reveal some things that you didn't know, and there were some interesting things that I'll come back to in a second. But more importantly, what uncertainty surveys can do is if you can construct them into a time series, you can then begin to make comparisons, and you can then begin to do your regression analyses or whatever to try to zero in on what some of the true features are. And some things are surprising, some aren't. But one of the things that the businesses said in the OECD survey was one of the biggest causes of uncertainty was arbitrary actions by tax authorities, and one of the things that tax authorities identified as the biggest cause of uncertainty was wayward action by corporations. Well, okay, but it's helpful to know that because it shows that even after 5+ years of talking about cooperative compliance, there are issues of trust out there. What it does highlight is that really one of the major ways of reducing uncertainty, in addition to not engaging in retroactive legislation and not doing arbitrary audits and all the rest of that stuff, is actually to build up trust between taxpayers and tax authorities. That is an idea which the FTA has pushed. Other organizations have pushed it as well. But it's an idea which at the moment is more in retreat, I think, than actually advancing. And that's a real shame. It's partly because some tax authorities feel under...
Well, I think, whatever you call it, whether it's horizontal monitoring, cooperative compliance, enhanced in relationship, this basically goes back now almost, we've got Jonathan, you have to be very careful what I say, yes, but it's basically 6 to 8 years, And it's interesting because initially, commissioners were very keen, business was less keen. Then it reversed, commissioners were less keen, business was keen. And we're in a situation today where neither party, it's like people standing on a dance floor and asking, do we dance or not? Right. Yeah. And at the moment, people are not dancing. And I think, in fact, if you're concerned with uncertainty, things like cooperative compliance, however, what the term you use, are a very effective way of reducing that. And the difficulty you've got, Will, as you've said, is to get into such these programs, you need that trust. Yeah, right. It's a leap of faith. Yeah, and at the moment, I think largely because of BEPS, probably countries and businesses are a little bit reluctant. I think what we need to kickstart this, in fact, is to have some companies and some countries to come together and actually show that it can work. It doesn't help that the Netherlands, who led all this work, have backed off, or the UK has backed off. Yeah. And I know there's some Latin American countries that they say they have cooperative compliance, yeah? But that's like saying you smoke Cuban cigars and you end up by sort of a weed from around your garden, yeah? So I think it's an interesting analogy there, yeah? But the other thing perhaps that I just would emphasize what you've said, because in a sense, when you read the report to the G20, you got the impression that, well, it's it's basically it's governments that have to do things to address, and so it's both governments and business. Yeah? And if business can be a little bit more responsive, a little bit more transparent, a bit more prepared to comply with the spirit and the letter of the law, then in a sense, you can move forward.
But it is very much a thing where both sides have to move forward together. There cannot be a huge give from either side, otherwise. So let me just deal with a couple of things that you talked about. So, there's uncertainty from source versus residence. This is, there either is or there isn't. I mean, it was something which was, as you say, specifically taken off the table in BEPS. One of the interesting things is that actually the source versus residence argument, again, appears to be, sort of really very almost late 20th century now, because people are beginning to talk about destination rather than source. I think what it shows you is that one of the causes of uncertainty, this is sort of, you could read this in the newspapers, but you're here, so, one of the causes of uncertainty is because there are some economies which are rising, others which are declining, because the nature of business has changed, the shape of tax bases is changing. And the way that business is being done is changing. Some of the rules are clearly not built to capture certain types of things. I mean, digital, again, is the big example. And therefore, what you have is uncertainty about the direction of the tax system, uncertainty about what rules to apply, uncertainty about what you're going to be able to tax. And those aren't things which can be cured by cooperative compliance. They aren't things which can be cured, at least at the moment, by rules, because we don't know where we're going to end up. In fact, in some cases, we don't know where we currently are, and we really don't know where we're going to end up. So the uncertainty is, essentially, it's in the air. And what that means is, to counter that, really the two best things that you can do are firstly to ensure that there are open channels of communication between countries, that there are open channels of communication between business, between national governments, between international organizations, and yes, between other stakeholders, so that there is a full conversation going on about what it is that's actually happening. And then the other part is that there is some type of, firstly, the governments feel at least they've backstopped anti-avoidance, so that they don't feel that they're constantly having to play catch-up, which is part of the problem with unilateralism. And the other is that equally businesses feel that there is enough substance in dispute resolution mechanisms that even if they get caught at the front end, they should get out okay at the back end. But, that, in a sense, that's unsatisfactory. We like to think of ourselves as, particularly policy people, as people who can come up with rational solutions to problems which will get general agreement. But when the whole landscape is shifting, you can't do that.
And I think that really is a problem, because you've got the shift of political and economic power, from the west to the east. You've got the US in a state of flux. You've got the technology coming online. You've got changing business models. And part of the difficulty is that for high-tax European states, high-tax welfare states, that is really proving quite a challenge. Because at the same time as you see your revenue base being challenged, you've got a lot of expenditures coming up, whether it's on health, whether it's on retirement or whatever. So I think it's a sort of an interesting, and whenever you get this type of crossroads where there's a systemic shift, of economic power, the tax base follows where the economic power is. So I think that's quite a hard one. We had just there's a question from Chris online to really talk about coming back to the multilateralism, and what do you think about all these unilateral measures that are being put in place that effectively override tax treaties? Is that a step back for multilateralism?
There are some countries which have a history of overriding tax treaties, so I'll be a little careful talking about that. As we discussed before, as I said, BEPS has put more stuff out there and given permission people to think more about various unilateral actions, and some countries have started to do those. In one sense, I mean, it depends exactly who I'm talking to. I don't think I would overstate, however, how far unilateralism has gone. I would be very concerned, as we'll talk about in a moment in relation to digital, that if there is no agreement there, then there will be unilateral actions in the digital area, which will be very damaging, I think, to future growth. I also think that we face problems around permanent establishments, not so much about permanent establishments, although there will clearly more will be asserted as time goes by, but in relation to profit attribution, which is at the heart of the issue, which is also at the heart of digital, and where there is no agreement because, as I said, the landscape is, the tectonic plates are shifting. You know, different people think different things about what they should be able to
but that's what makes it an exciting time to be in tax.
It is clearly an exciting time to be in tax.
And in a sense, it's not bad that we begin this sort of debate on some of the fundamental concepts that we have. Yeah?
But just to that question, I do want to come back to this because I know that there is a sort of creeping suspicion of tax treaties. And, you know, it is arguable that driving withholding rates down to zero has perhaps not been the best thing because it puts a huge amount of pressure on the substantive rules, and not all of the substantive rules are quite up to scratch. That said, driving withholding tax rates down from very high levels to reasonable levels, I think was absolutely the right thing to do, and it's clearly encouraged cross-border trade investment. But the thing that I would say, and I say this to my friends in the NGO community and wherever else, is there is no doubt that the certainty, even with a PPT, that the certainty that a tax treaty provides to an investor into a foreign country, particularly a developing country where the rule of law may not have deep roots, is fundamental to that investment. And that without that, there are going to be less investors, there is going to be less investment, there is going to be less growth, and there is going to be less strength in those countries. So there is still a good reason for doing tax treaties. They are an important part of creating certainty and enabling that to go. And yes, there may be some inequalities within tax treaties, but to throw the whole thing out would be an absolute disaster.
Yeah, I'm smiling because, in fact, yesterday we had a meeting here of 50 people, including some organizations that have been advocating determinate tax treaties on the future of tax treaties, where we are going, and I don't think we entirely agreed, but where we did sort of agree was that we need to actually have more fact-based evidences and to actually look at what type of, where treaties come in, where they play, and also that we must overcome this simplification of saying that tax treaties are bad. They can be good treaties, they can be bad treaties. If you have a bad treaty, then the answer is to renegotiate, not to terminate, and telling developing countries not to enter into tax treaties, well, not to enter into bad tax treaties, I agree, but your treaty is as good as your treaty negotiator, Why don't we move on to the third round? And I am, for the people on the virtual stuff, I am looking at your questions, and I'll pick some of them up in a minute, So on the digital tax agenda, the digitalization, in a recent blog, he's written just a great blog. I don't know how his employers give him permission to write it, because it's actually interesting, so you have to read it, Where did they get it from?
Now they all know as well.
Okay. So anyway, in a blog where you were saying, in fact, that the digital economy is the whole economy. The digital changes are disruptive. I think anybody can't disagree with that. I think the challenge that we have, we're moving into a period of rapid dematerialization. This is putting pressure on traditional concepts, whether it's the PE concepts or some of the allocation rules, and we'll pick up some of these, Alfred, in the discussion that we'll have tomorrow. Business models of companies like Facebook are very different from the type of business models that we are traditionally used to dealing with. The fact that data has effectively become a fourth factor of production. That consumers, we're not just consuming, but we're actually also contributing to the production process. And the way then the governments are responding to this. You mentioned earlier we've had the BEPS Action 1. In some ways, a good analysis, but the outcome of putting on the table a range of options perhaps wasn't the cleverest approach, without saying what was good or bad, because then countries have cherry-picked, But I mean, currently, my reading of where we stand, everybody is waiting for the April report, I mean, now the OECD has very clearly said that there's going to be some substance there. It's not going to be just on processes. And it seems to me that there are broadly two approaches or maybe even three approaches on the table. One is to follow some sort of consumption turnover approach. I mean, the equalization tax that you have in India, that's now more or less been endorsed by the European Union, Some are talking about, well, maybe we need to review where we are on withholding taxes, yes, and some are talking about maybe looking at minimum taxes, yeah? And then you have the longer-term debate of actually asking, well, is it time to revisit fundamentally, it's a nice word, fundamentally, some of our basic concepts? I mean, have we got to the point where we've stretched the PE concept? You know, the first thing that I was given to do when I went to the OECD in 1972 was to write a paper for Working Party 1 on PE, yeah? And the last thing I did, in fact, was to write something on PE when I left in 2012, yeah? I suspect when they bury me, my hand will come up and say, a permanent grave, yeah? A permanent grave, yeah? You know, and, you know, part of the problem we've got here, Will, is all our lives we've made this enormous intellectual investment in this concept, yeah? Yeah? And you've got 3,600 treaties around the world that are based on it, yeah? It's the bedrock, yeah? So it's like people say, well, you know, it's too important to play with, yeah? And yet, you know, unless you adapt it, it becomes irrelevant to today's world, yeah? And so, you know, are we getting to the point where we've stretched it so far that we just say, maybe there is something new? I mean, he has his ideas about a digital PE, yeah? Does it resolve it? I don't know, yeah? Or do we actually say, well, maybe the way to move the debate on is to make a much clearer distinction between, you know, how you tax profits and how you tax the activities, particularly consumption, or the use of data, you know, by these new type of digital enterprises. So what do you... Give us some words of wisdom. We need it in this area, yeah?
I'm not sure I can give you those. I mean, this is an amazingly interesting area. I mean, this is, for the first time in, I don't know, 50, 60, maybe 100 years. Everybody keeps going back to 1920. But, you know, this is something which is dramatically new. And it's something which is happening right now. And it is something which truly we don't understand, but at the same time also truly know at some level is going to dramatically change almost everything. And not just in tax. I mean, you know, there's enough stuff about AI and machine learning and, you know, what's this going to mean and mechanization, and to be sure that it is on a continuum. You know, I mean, one of the reasons why, you know, a lot of metal bashing jobs are never going to come back is because those jobs are done by machines, and they have been done by machines for, you know, 10...
We just enjoy the life of leisure, yeah, with the universal credit that we just go out there, no work.
Well, yeah, this is the point at which somebody always says, well, didn't Keynes say that in the 1930s and it didn't happen? Well, he did.
I don't think people could exist without work, but maybe I'm just biased.
You know, so there are these dramatic changes coming. They're going to be enormously disruptive. They are already becoming enormously disruptive. I mean, you know, and it's not just you know, metal bashing jobs. It's the people who used to do discovery in law firms. I mean, you know, that's now done by...
Well, you look at IBM Watson, yeah? Yep. Every day it improves its capacity to provide tax advice, huh? And the more it does, the more it learns, huh?
So I'm told. Anyway, so let's talk about some of these things. But I mean, it is really important to understand that we do not yet really have a grip on what it is that's happening, other than the fact that something quite dramatic is happening. And there is obviously a desire amongst countries, tax authorities, both to get an advantage for themselves, could be a revenue advantage, could be an investment advantage, but also to try and keep a hold of what they currently have for fear that it's going to disappear. And that creates a, how can I put it, a sort of febrile situation, I suppose. And it is made more difficult, or the challenges are accentuated by the fact that there are a very small number of countries, really two, maybe sort of a couple in a rung below that, who are the clear world leaders in quite a lot of the technology involved and are reaping the...
This is not Austria, by the way, yeah?
Maybe that's in the second tier. But, you know, who are clearly reaping the rewards of this. And it is beginning already to change the shape of tax bases. Now, you know, in a sense, that's not a new thing. I mean, I was saying to Jeff, I haven't yet perfected this analogy, maybe I never can. But, you know, if I have a car industry in country A and a car industry in country B, and country A discovers, you know, much more efficient ways of producing cars, maybe it does all that mechanization, and maybe some of this stuff is patented, so it can't be copied in country B. The country B car business, you know, just goes out of business because it can't compete. Country A then supplies all the cars. This could be the UK maybe, but country A then supplies all the cars into country B. They're sold into country B. There isn't the infrastructure in country B. There aren't the jobs in country B. There isn't the tax revenue in country B. So that's a big change. Okay. Now, what can country B do about that? Well, it can't impose tariffs because we have rules against that. Could it tax country A as though it were doing business in country B because it's actually selling? Well, sure, from a sales tax point of view, it can do. And yeah, if there are car distributors who are owned by country A, then you can do the usual TP stuff around that. But will you ever be able to recreate the tax base which was there before in terms of either corporate income or personal income or social security taxes? No. Now, economic theory will tell you other jobs will grow up, and economic theory also tells you that eventually, you'll reach a new equilibrium for one reason or another. But we faced that problem already, and at least in that sense, digital isn't terribly different. Some countries have found this huge competitive advantage, which they're now taking advantage of. Now, there are clearly some important issues which BEPS set out to deal with, which was that this income was not coming back to at least one of the countries which was enormously successful in this, but was ending up in other jurisdictions not being taxed very much, and in some cases not being taxed at all. That was a BEPS issue. That was dealt with. But in terms of how we think about how we should deal with this dramatically new situation, these dramatically new business models, and not just in social media, but all over. Again, without naming names, once you put software in the cloud, for example, once you put infrastructure in the cloud, as has been pointed out, you give people a huge advantage, not just at the big end of the market, but at the small end as well. Because instead of having to build up, your own IT department, build your, keep your servers, buy the software, maintain all that stuff, have tech people running around the whole time. No, you can rent it for a couple of $100.
You see, and that's a really important point that gets lost both at the OECD and the EU. When we're talking about digitalization, we all tend to think of large multinational enterprises. Yeah? But I mean, a lot of the innovation is coming from the small startups. Yeah? Yeah. And these companies, they are global from day one. Right. Yeah? And so you have to think of, well, how do the existing rules we have, how do they play for this group? Because the one thing you don't want to do is to set your tax rules up in such a way that it favors the very big IT companies and penalizes the very small.
Right. That's absolutely right. So let me just go, I'm looking at your watch, so let me just go briefly to the things that you mentioned. So the first is equalization taxes, at least the one in India is actually a withholding tax. It's not an equalization tax, but anyway. Turnover taxes in Europe, are those a good idea? No, I don't think they are, because I don't think turnover taxes full stop are a good idea. There was a reason why we moved away from turnover taxes in the first place, which was they cascade, they affect certain businesses regardless of the amount of profit they have. So, if you have very high turnover and very low margins, you're going to be very adversely affected by a turnover tax. They're just not a great idea, okay? Will we see them? Yeah, probably. Does that make them better? No, not really. But there they are, and that's a response. Digital Ps, sorry, Raphael, I don't think they're a great idea. And the reason why I don't think they're a great idea is because, as Jeffrey said, they take a concept, an income tax concept, which has worked relatively well for quite a long time, at least in the physical setting, and continues to work well in the physical setting, with some of the tweaks which were made during BEPS, and not just the change in the standard, and it would be nice to have more detail around that, but not just the change in the standard, also the anti-fragmentation rules, and some of the stuff around auxiliary and preparatory. I think those rules have been updated, and as I say, with more definition and a little bit of bedding down, in the physical context they work well. I think we will kill them stone dead if we introduce the concept of a digital PE, because once you untether the PE from that physical presence, you lose that consensus around the fact, which has been built up around Ps, that essentially there is a level of involvement, at least of physical businesses, which gives the other country a right to tax this, because the value is being created there. I mean, that's really the theory behind this. And what digital PEs are, essentially, is an attempt to say, we need somehow to get this. And here's a way of doing it. And as I say, I think you'll ruin the whole PE concept. And I think that would be a mistake. There's the subsidiary issue, which will, again, we should touch about briefly, which is that the issue which we haven't solved in BEPS, and we have still not yet solved post-BEPS, and we need to solve in relation to digital, is how do we attribute profit? If we're going to stick with a profits tax, then how do we attribute profit? As I said to you earlier,
you even go back. I mean, it's how do we define value? How do we measure value? And how do we attribute? Yeah,
absolutely.
Because I mean, a lot of the BEPS stuff is this concept that tax must follow value. Right. It sounds great. Yeah. But we ain't got agreement yet on what do we mean by value.
No, and I mean, I said the last time I was here that one of the confusions that we have is that we look at digital and we look at a number of other things in a very transactional way. We look at it transaction by transaction. And we then try to apply transactional solutions to profit taxes. And the two don't go together because profit is an agglomeration of many things. It's not just, an aggregation of profit. It's not just an aggregation of transactions. It's not just an aggregation of turnover. It is something very different to that. And in order to be able to determine what profit is, I mean, obviously, you can tweak the tax bases, and that's to a certain extent at least part of what the CCCTB does. You can tweak tax bases, but above whatever it is that the corporation doesn't need to function as a corporation is the profit. Okay, so the question is, if that's done across borders, how do you attribute that? Traditionally, economically, I think what you're trying to do, and I use the word reward quite loosely, but what you're trying to do is to reward the places where that value is created through the tax system by allowing that country to tax some of that. And if you change that by either going to something which is much more transaction-based, and don't forget there are sales taxes, or if you do it in a way which reduces essentially the rewards to innovation, which again is one of the dangers of moving, or at least one of the dangers we need to think about in moving away from traditional concepts of valuation, then you come up with something which really isn't a profits tax. I mean, and there may be good reasons for doing that. So, the other thing I just want to touch on briefly is Jeffrey's raised, everybody raises, this question of the value of data. It's an important issue. It is not the only issue, but it is an important issue in some sectors. I do not think that we yet fully have gotten to grips intellectually with this idea of data. I mean, a very common way of thinking about it is the data's collected, it's analyzed, the advertising revenue is directed based on what the data tells you. It doesn't work like that. It really doesn't work like that. And even if it did in that very narrow set of circumstances, there is data in a much wider set of circumstances which works in very different ways. It may be industrial data, okay? So, the Internet of Things. It may be about helping to improve service. It may be about helping, sort of monitoring machines. It may be about all sorts of things in there. And again, is that something which has an independent value, or is that something which is actually part of, something which is physical? I don't know, but we need to think about that. And there are other cases where, as people tell me, there are these vast, I don't know what they are, bytes, terabytes, whatever they are, the biggest ones, of this stuff which is collected. And what happens is there is only value when somebody essentially launches an algorithm, launches a bot into that data, and it pulls out a few quite discrete things which are important in that data. The data itself is this big, undifferentiated pool. There is some stuff in there which is useful and which is valuable. But you don't know what that is until you start to ask for it. So again, this is not to say that there is not value in that, and we don't need to think about that. What it is to say is we are at the beginning of the beginning of our understandings of how this is going to work. And again, you talk about Watson, you talk about AI, you talk about machine learning. This is something which is going to go like that, and we're here right now. But if we design a tax system here, then we do really have the possibility of making that it's not going to go like that, but maybe it goes like that instead.
I mean, that's why you need a good dialogue between government, business, academics, technologists, yes?
Right.
And you've got to have the technology because they understand, what's happening on the ground. Right. They understand, where value is being created, yeah?
Therefore, I very much hope that when the OECD report comes out, and again, the EC, the European Commission proposals will come out before, probably before, almost certainly before the EU report. And, I very much hope, I suspect that they will have to respond to the politics on the ground, and that they will say something about interim measures. It was interesting. I think somebody told me that there had been a clarification that short-term measures could be enacted in the short term rather than only lasting in the short term.
I believe that when I see it, yeah.
Right, but I think there will be that. But I also very much hope that the Commission will also recognise the importance of the OECD project and recognise the importance of needing to have a much more detailed, longer-term, and really, really importantly, multi-stakeholder conversation about where this is going. And that's not to say it should take 10 years, but it is to say it should take months. Rather than days. And so I hope that the OECD report will steer us in that direction, where there will be a process which the OECD is good at doing, which pulls people in and has a really thoughtful way of looking at this. So that's what I would hope for. But if we start reacting now with the essentially lack of understanding we have, with a very small snapshot of a very small number of companies, we will undoubtedly come out with a tax system which does not help growth, does not help with the disruption, and simply distorts the activity which will occur.
I think it sounds very logical. The big issue you're going to face is politics, yes, and whether politicians are going to be patient enough for their outcome. Why don't we take one or two questions, because this must be a topic, except for Raffaele, who's not allowed any questions. Any comments or questions on what Will has said on digitalization? Stig? No, you'd be playing it safe.
We need to have 2 minutes on US tax.
Yeah, okay. Okay, you can have one little question, and go ahead, yeah? This is going to be one of the main topics for tomorrow morning as well, so yeah.
I don't want to spoil the discussion on the digitalization of the economy that we have tomorrow, so I will not ask about that. What is more my concern is how much of these debates and solutions that has been conceived are related to something that OECD and eventually BRICS can handle and can make use of, and how much are instead something that can be used or can be perceived as useful by the real developing countries. So not anymore China, that is almost an OECD country, a country in its own economy, or India or Brazil, but some developing countries. So are these solutions something that can bring developing countries on board, or are useful tools to them?
You're talking about the BEPS solutions more generally.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I mean that's a really good question, and it is clear that if you put together the OECD and the G20, you have a group of very large countries for the most part, some smaller European ones, but still well off and developed, and the developed countries were left out of that process. It was the formation of the inclusive framework was a little late. And in the sense that many of the decisions had already been made. However, the implementation decisions had not been made. The UN has also done good work. And, I think it's important that the OECD takes, I think, the inclusive framework very seriously. And I do think that we need to continue to work on some of these solutions. I mean, there are even before BEPS, when you were there, Jeffrey, the OECD was working on what was called TP Light. And, I think...
It's not a beer, by the way, yeah? TP Light.
No, it's better than a beer. I think the work that's being done around domestic resource mobilization, capacity building, the sort of tax inspectors without border stuff, I think all of that is helpful. I think there has to be a laser-like focus moving forward on how rules can be fashioned to be administrable in developing countries as well as in developed countries, and to understand that those rules may not always be the same.
And in a sense, simplified safe harbors, anything that can reflect the fact that these countries have very weak capacity. Yeah?
Did have a question.
Stig, I thought we would not be able to move on without you, yes?
Yeah.
Sorry, we can go on for another 10 minutes, it's okay, yeah? So.
Will, when you commented on using transactional taxes, maybe as to target profit, which is, but then you said that, well, that's not the answer because profits are always a result of many factors. I'm paraphrasing what you said. Could this mean that you would look favorably to in transfer pricing, that we would move somewhat away from the transactional, the pure transactional methodologies, and over to other ways of applying the arm's length principle, recognizing that profits is a result of synergies, of many contributions?
Nice, easy question.
It is a nice, easy question. So I'm not going to give you my view on that. I am going to tell you, however, that we appear to be moving in that direction. I mean, you identified synergies. I mean, clearly in the new transfer pricing guidance guidelines, there are reference to synergies. My view is that we should try and make the arm's length standard work, but we should also be honest if we can't make the arm's length standard work. And I think, part of the discussion, and this is, I think digital can be in a sense, a test case for this, is, can we make traditional standards work in this new world? And if we can't, then I think there comes a point, and I said this during the BEPS consultation, there may come a point where, we say, we're not going to torture this thing to death. We do need to have some new thinking. And, some of that new thinking, may be, for example, around destination-based. I mean, I was surprised at the hearing in, the OECD public hearing in Berkeley, to hear the US say, well, maybe we should think about allocating, 30% of the market and do the rest on transfer pricing. I'm not sure that that's the answer, but I'm not sure I know what the answer is either. And I do think that as we, again, as we try to determine where things are going, as Jeffrey said, the discussion that we didn't have in BEPS was about allocation of taxing rights. You can call that source versus residence, you can call it whatever you want. But there wasn't that discussion about the allocation of taxing rights. And what that meant was, because that was the elephant in the middle of the room, it actually popped up by proxy in most of the BEPS things. Now, sometimes it popped up a little more obviously. So in the anti-hybrid stuff, for example, the imported mismatches rule, the sort of third country mismatch rule, is a change of taxing rights. It's a reallocation of taxing rights. There are other places where it was a little more hidden. Some of the transfer pricing rules sort of shift you in that direction. But if that's the way that the world's going to go, and there is a dissatisfaction with the way that the current rules are working, then let's be open about that. And let's do it. We have, and this goes to the point about permanent establishments that I was making before, and it's not, I promise you, it's not a knee-jerk reaction. But if we have a concept that works well in one place, but we then try and stretch it to cover something else, which it can't cover as a sort of logical, intellectual matter, then let's not do that. Let's try and think about something else. But I equally believe that it's far too easy to say, it's all broken. We need to do something else. What I think we need to do is to start from this point of value creation, and yes, what is value? How is it created? And then try and determine if the rules, the principles that we currently have can be adapted to deal with new situations. If they can, fabulous. But if they can't, then we do need to think about it. But, in part to bring countries along, but I think also just to ensure that, we try and come up with the best system that we can do, even though it won't be perfect, we need to go through that process, in a sort of logical, coherent way. And that's not to preordain where we're going to end up, But it does say this is the starting point we should take.
That's quite a nice, in fact, lead into the last round, which is on US tax reform, or what I call American First tax reform. Yeah? I mean, I think a lot of people were surprised it happened. There was a hell of a lot of talk about it before it did happen, yeah? It's one of the biggest single cuts in the corporate tax rate that I've ever known. You're going from 35 to 21, or 39 to 24, depending if you put the states in, yeah? So it's a pretty significant, change in the corporate tax rate. The move towards a territorial system, even one can argue about how far it's actually moved towards territorial. The IP boxes, the BEAT, the anti-tax, anti-abuse provisions. There's a lot there. I mean, it's quite hard at this point to say, well, what are the implications? Because there's a lot of technical details that remain outside, yeah? There's also questions of, what's going to be the overall macroeconomic effects, because what we've seen in the last few days is that it's quite likely that the Fed will offset some of the advantages of the tax reform by raising interest rates. And then you have the big elephant in the room of whether some of the advantages or the competitive advantages for the US of the reform could be offset by what happens on the trade side. Yeah. So a lot of questions there. But a question for you, Will. How, and you travel a lot, I know, yeah. How do you see countries, how are they grappling? I mean, we know companies are in a mess, yeah. They're trying to figure out what does this mean, yeah. Both inward investors and outward investors. But from the country's perspective, how do you think they're going to react? Are they going to try to, in fact, maintain their competitiveness, reduce their corporate tax rates? Are we going to see a race to the bottom? Are we going to see more non-OECD countries going down the route of IP boxes? Are we going to see a spread of incentives? I mean, what's your reaction, or what's your impression of the way that countries are going to react to these changes?
All of the above.
Excellent. That's very nice. We'll have a drink now then, yeah?
Okay. So at a little more length. I don't know is the answer, because it really is still quite early. I mean, as you say, at one level, my much cleverer than me technical colleagues are still going through it, going, ooh, that happens, really? So, there are a lot of interactions which haven't yet been thought through, and we won't quite know how it'll work. And to give one example, the foreign-derived intangible income, which is the patent box part of this, actually has a rather strange interaction with some of the other provisions, which mean that taking advantage of it, even if you weren't worried about the WTO aspect, mean that it may be hard to do. But what are foreign countries? How are they reacting to it? Well, that again is actually really quite interesting, because I think that I discern a development of their views as they understand more of what's in the legislation. So, I mean, the initial, at least pre-enactment view was represented by the letters from the 5 finance ministers to Secretary Mnuchin, and the letter, the almost chronologically simultaneous letter with from the commissioners to the Treasury. And that focused very much on GILTI, on FDI, on the low tax intangible income, the foreign derived intangible income, and the base erosion anti-avoidance tax. And some of the concerns around that, the concern that at least the first two, or the FDII part of it strictly, was an export incentive. It's ring-fenced. It doesn't conform with sort of BEPS 5. I think it's BEPS 5. The patent box stuff, it wasn't related to R&D spend or whatever. The range of intangibles was much broader, so that was that. And then there was the BEAT, which particularly worried a number of sectors, particularly banking and reinsurance. And so, the focus of the letters was on that, and basically, sort of how bad that was. And there wasn't a great deal of focus on what some of the other provisions did. I think as time has gone by, it's most dramatic in the talk about GILTI, which just, struck me as bizarre when I first heard it. Because what GILTI is, actually, it's a minimum tax. I mean, it really is. It's a minimum tax. And it's a minimum tax, to be sure, on the aggregate. So, if you have a higher tax over here and a lower tax over here, you'll still blend it to, 13 point whatever. But nevertheless, it's a real live minimum tax. And actually, in a territorial system, that's unusual. And you could look at any other territorial system you wanted to, and actually the tax rates that that, you know, companies headquartered in that country can drive their rates down to is a whole lot lower, you know, than 13 point something percent. So actually, that's a pretty dramatic change. And you ally that with the BEPS provisions, you know, the cash box stuff, the, you know, just transferring paper risks, all of that. And you tie it in with PPT as well, which discourages circuitous treaty routes. And you actually have a pretty dramatic change in the way things go on. With the FDII, as I say, it's in part because of the uncertainty. I don't think people are using it. With the BEAT, there are plenty of American companies that get caught by the BEAT as well. But then, you know, in addition to GILTI, so the minimum tax, there are really strong anti-hybrid rules, a more stringent interest deductibility provision than was recommended by the OECD. There's actually quite a lot of, you know, BEPS stuff in here, really. And yeah, the rate came down, and it really should have done. I mean, it was 35% was nuts in the current world. Do I think there's a race to the bottom? No, I don't think there's a race to the bottom. You know, I don't know if there's a natural rate, and I suspect at some point rates will go back up again, a little bit at least. But, you know, this is about the US re-entering into, you know, sort of the competitive tax regime space. It isn't the lowest. Obviously, it isn't the lowest. You know where the lowest where they are. But it is about putting itself back in the zone where the US tax system doesn't, I'll use this word because I think it's the right word, it does not force US multinationals to keep huge amounts of income offshore, because otherwise to repatriate you're going to pay, you know, twice what your competitors are paying. It means for the first time in quite a long time that it's not a bargain to buy a US company from overseas, because you can immediately make money on extracting everything out from underneath the US. It puts the US back in a better place. And I think, you know, whatever you may think about some of the characters involved, I think that the benefits that this will bring to the tax system overall are actually quite large. Because it just, at least over time, you know, I mean, as I said right at the beginning, part of the problem is that, you know, the tax stories which light a fire in the press are planning which went on, you know, a decade or more ago. So those stories are going to continue to pop up. But over time, it will be seen that this has had an effect. You know, does that mean that US corporations want to pay more than 13 point whatever it is overseas? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that they'll do that blending? Yes, they will do that blending. No. But it will have a dramatic difference. And, you know, if you look at comparative effective tax rates of other corporations, at least in certain sectors, you know, that's pretty much in the range.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of debate we could have about these. I mean, one thing is clear, it's not a major simplification. I think, you know, there's many provisions there, which is inevitable if you're a large country like the US. Nobody would like a simple corporate tax system, yeah? And it certainly doesn't rule out tax planning. It closes off certain tax planning, it opens up new tax plan. I think where you're right is say, and that's a good thing, that, you know, it should stimulate a more fundamental debate of where we're going on our corporate taxes, right. Not just in a digital environment, yeah, but where we're going on corporate taxes at the OECD, yeah? Right. And that would be a good thing. It'd be a good thing for the European Union, yeah? It'll be a good thing for the BRICS, it'll be a good thing for the OECD countries. Yeah? Look, we're going to have to stop there because we have 15 minutes over. So I won't take it. And I know we have some questions online, and I'll try to get back to you on those afterwards. Yeah? I'd like to thank you, Will. That was a really you know, pleasure to hear you. You're always so coherent and so convincing. Of course, you go back and you think about what he said. But did he really say that? Yeah.
I hear that the whole time.
And so that's been a real pleasure. I'd like to thank Melody and Rene and all the technical team for putting this on. The next Fireside Chat, the 21st, that's going to be a fun one. We're going to have 3 African commissioners here on the 22nd of February. And the title is, wait for it, Paradise Lost, Revenue Gained. Okay, you don't have to laugh straight away, yeah? The cocktail, the best thing is to follow the VU people that know it. It's basically in the orange building that's turn to the right, walk down, you see a big orange building, go up to the 2nd floor, and that's where the cocktail is. But rather than get lost, just follow one of us and we'll get there, yeah? Drinks await you, and it's all free as well, yeah? Thank you very much, Will. That was a real pleasure.